The wooden platform felt rough beneath Lyra's bare feet, each splinter catching against her skin as she shifted her weight. She kept her eyes down, watching the grain of the wood blur as people walked past, their boots heavy against the boards. Their voices carried over her head like she wasn't even there, just another piece of merchandise to be examined and evaluated. This one's 22, comes from good stock, but she's barren. Her father's voice cut through the market noise like a blade. Lyra's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. After 3 years of trying with her arranged mate, after the healers shaking their heads with barely concealed pity, after the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, here she was, being sold like livestock because she couldn't give anyone children. The morning sun beat down on her shoulders, making the coarse fabric of her dress stick to her skin. She could smell sawdust and unwashed bodies, could hear coins jingling in purses as potential buyers weighed their options. Her hands trembled at her sods, and she clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. "Baron?" A woman's voice rose with interest. "How much for her, then?" Lyra closed her eyes, fighting the wave of nausea that rolled through her stomach. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Her parents had fed her and housed her for 22 years, and she'd given them nothing in return. No grandchildren to carry on their name, no alliance through marriage to strengthen their position, just shame and disappointment wrapped in a woman's skin. 50 silver pieces, her father said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who rehearsed this moment. The woman laughed, a harsh sound that scraped against Lyra's nerves. "For damaged goods, 20. Damaged goods. The words settled in Lyra's stomach like stones, cold and heavy and impossible to digest. She pressed her lips together to keep from making a sound. She was damaged, broken, worthless, except for whatever labor someone might get out of her before her body gave out entirely. 35. Her father countered, and Lyra could hear the edge of desperation creeping into his voice. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. Even now, standing on a platform like a piece of furniture, he was trying to get something for her. She should be grateful, she told herself. Her parents could have just thrown her out, left her to starve in the streets or beg for scraps. Instead, they'd brought her here where someone might take her in, give her work. A place to sleep, a purpose that didn't involve the children she'd never have. She lifted her head just enough to see the crowd milling between the platforms. Men and women walked between the raised stages, examining the people for sale with the same attention they'd give to livestock. Some of the merchandise were criminals working off debts, their crimes tattooed on their forearms in dark ink. Others were like her, unwanted by their families, for various reasons that boiled down to the same thing. They'd failed to meet expectations. "I'll take her for 30. A different voice, gravelly and tired. With an undertone that made her skin crawl, Lyra looked toward the sound and her stomach dropped. An older man with yellowed teeth grinned at her, his eyes roving over her body in a way that made her want to wrap her arms around herself. His clothes were stained with grease and something else she didn't want to identify, and he smelled like he hadn't washed in weeks. The way he licked his lips while looking at her made bile rise in her throat. 30 it is, her father said, relief evident in his voice. No. Her heart started racing, panic clawing up her throat like a living thing. Not him. Anyone but him. She'd seen that look before, had nightmares about what men like that did to women who had no one to protect them. Her legs felt weak and spots danced at the edges of her vision. Actually, I'll take her. This voice was different, deeper, with an undertone of authority that seemed to resonate in her bones. It cut through the market chatter like a sword through silk, making everyone around the platform go completely still. Even the constant buzz of conversation from the surrounding stalls seemed to fade. Lyra looked up and forgot how to breathe. The man standing in front of her platform was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Dark hair fell across his forehead, catching the sunlight, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds just before lightning struck. He wore simple clothes, leather boots, dark pants, a shirt that stretched across his chest. But something about the way he carried himself made it clear he was used to being obeyed. But it wasn't his looks that made her chest tight with sudden, inexplicable hope. It was the way everyone around him had gone completely still, like prey animals sensing a predator. Even her father's face had gone pale, all the color draining out of his cheeks as recognition dawned. "Alpha King," her father stammered, his voice shaking. We didn't know you were." The title hit Lyra like a physical blow. Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, the ruler of all the werewolf packs, was standing in front of her platform, looking at her like she was something precious instead of something to be discarded. "How much?" the man asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made her shiver. "For her?" Her father looked confused, glancing between Lyra and the Alpha King, like he couldn't understand what was happening. "She's barren, Your Majesty. She can't give you heirs. Surely you'd prefer—" "I asked how much." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. The crowd around them pressed back, giving the Alpha King space while straining to hear every word. Lyra could feel their eyes on her, full of confusion and speculation and something that might have been envy. The older man who'd wanted to buy her had backed away, melting into the crowd like he'd never been there. Smart man, Lyra thought distantly. Even she could feel the danger radiating from the Alpha King, contained but unmistakable. 50 silver, her father said quickly, his merchant's instincts overriding his confusion. The Alpha King pulled a small leather pouch from his belt without taking his eyes off Lyra. The pouch looked heavy, and when he tossed it to her father, she heard the clink of more than silver. "Keep the change." Lyra stared at him, her mind reeling. This had to be some kind of mistake. Alpha Kings didn't buy infertile women at markets. They married suitable females from powerful families. Women who could give them strong children to carry on their bloodlines and forge political alliances. They certainly didn't spend what sounded like a small fortune on damaged goods. "Come," he said, extending his hand toward her. She didn't move, couldn't move. Her legs felt like water, and her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This was wrong. He didn't understand. If he knew the truth, really knew, he'd walk away like everyone else had. "I can't have children," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her voice sounded small and broken, barely audible over the market noise. The healers all said, "I heard." "Then why?" "Because I want you." Want. Not need, not a business arrangement, not settling for what was available. Want. The word hit her like lightning, illuminating dark corners of her heart she'd forgotten existed. No one had ever wanted her. Her arranged mate had taken her because their fathers had made a deal, had touched her with duty rather than desire. Her parents had kept her out of obligation and guilt. But want? She took his hand. His fingers were warm and calloused from sword work, rough against her softer skin, and when they closed around hers, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe, which was ridiculous because she didn't know anything about him except his reputation. And most of what she'd heard involved people who crossed him ending up dead. But his touch was gentle, careful, like she was something precious that might break. He helped her down from the platform, his other hand coming up to steady her at the elbow when she stumbled slightly. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand, and the ground felt strange beneath her feet after hours on the wooden platform. "Easy," he said softly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "You're safe now." The market crowd parted around them as they walked, people pressing back against the stalls and keeping their heads bowed. Lyra felt their eyes on her instead, full of confusion and speculation and barely concealed envy. She could hear the whispers starting already, questions about why the Alpha King would choose her, what he could possibly see in a woman everyone knew was defective. A woman at the Alpha King's side, a woman who'd just been sold at market like a piece of furniture. The incongruity of it made her head spin. "Your Majesty," a voice called from behind them. Lyra looked back to see a thin man in expensive clothes hurrying to catch up, flanked by 2 guards in royal colors. His face was flushed with exertion and what looked like barely controlled panic. "Counselor Reed," the Alpha King said without stopping or even slowing his pace. "Perhaps we should discuss this decision," the counselor said, slightly out of breath as he tried to match their pace. "The council should be consulted before." "The council doesn't choose my mate." Mate. The word hit Lyra like a physical blow, making her steps falter. He'd said mate, not servant or companion or concubine. Mate. The most sacred bond in their world, the connection that was supposed to last a lifetime and beyond. "Of course not, Your Majesty," Reed said quickly. "But surely." The Alpha King stopped walking so abruptly that Lyra nearly ran into him. When he turned around, something in his expression made the counselor take a step back, his face going pale. "Are you questioning my judgment, Reed?" No, of course not, Your Majesty. I simply meant that perhaps a more traditional approach might be warranted, given the circumstances." Lyra felt heat flood her cheeks, even without saying the words directly. Everyone knew what circumstances he meant. Her barrenness, her unsuitability, the fact that she was damaged goods who couldn't fulfill the most basic function expected of a mate. "Go back to the castle," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Tell the council I'll see them tomorrow." It wasn't a request. The counselor bowed quickly, his movements jerky with nervousness, and scurried away with his guards following. Lyra watched them go, her stomach churning with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Every person in his court, his pack, his kingdom would have the same reaction. They reached a carriage at the edge of the market square. It was simple but well-made, polished wood and brass fittings, pulled by 2 strong horses that stamped impatiently in their traces. Nothing like the elaborate royal carriages Lyra had imagined, but somehow that made it more real, more immediate. The Alpha King opened the door for her, his movements courteous despite everything that had just happened. When she hesitated on the step, he said, "What's your name?" "Lyra." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Lyra." The way he said it made her name sound different somehow, important, like it mattered. "I'm Kieran, and I promise you're safe with me." She looked into his eyes, searching for deception, for hidden motives, for the catch that had to be coming. Men like him didn't rescue women like her without expecting something in return. But all she saw was patience and something that might have been understanding. She got into the carriage. Kieran settled across from her, his long legs taking up most of the available space in the small interior. The carriage started moving with a gentle lurch, and the market sounds faded behind them, replaced by the steady clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones and the creak of wheels. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken fears. Lyra kept her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, and tried to process what had just happened. This morning, she'd woken up knowing she was going to be sold. She'd prepared herself for a life of drudgery, of being grateful for whatever scraps of kindness she could find. She hadn't prepared for this, for him. "I don't understand," Lyra said finally, her voice barely audible over the carriage noise. "Why me?" "Why not you?" The question caught her off guard. "Because I'm broken. Because I can't give you what you need." Kieran leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and she caught a whiff of his scent, something clean and masculine that made her pulse quicken. "What do you think I need?" "Heirs. Children to continue your bloodline. A proper mate from a good family who can help your kingdom." The words came out in a rush, all the things she'd heard whispered about what alpha kings required. Political alliances, strong connections. Someone who can stand beside you in court without people wondering what you were thinking. Is that what you think being a mate means? Lyra stared at him, confused. Isn't it? He was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes fixed on something outside the carriage window. The countryside was rolling past, green fields and scattered farmhouses, peaceful and beautiful in the afternoon light. When he looked back at her, his expression was softer, more vulnerable than she'd expected. My parents were true mates, he said, his voice carrying a note of old pain. They met when my mother was a servant in another pack's territory. She wasn't nobility, wasn't from a powerful family, couldn't even read when they met. Lyra felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, quickly squashed. But she could have children. She lost 3 before I was born. His voice grew quiet, heavy with old grief. The healers told her she'd never carry a baby to term, said her body was too weak, too damaged from the early losses. But my father chose her anyway, not because of what she could give him, but because of who she was. The hope stirred again, stronger this time. That's different. How? Because they were true mates. The bond chose them for each other. The moon goddess herself decided they belonged together. She gestured at herself helplessly, at the simple dress and work-roughened hands that marked her as common. This isn't the same thing. No, Kieran agreed, and the words hit her like a physical blow. It's not. Of course it wasn't the same. She'd been stupid to think, even for a moment, that this could be anything like that kind of love story. True mates were blessed by the goddess, chosen by fate itself. She was just a barren woman he'd bought at market for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. But it doesn't matter, he continued, his voice gentle but firm. True mate bonds are rare. Most people never find theirs. That doesn't mean they can't build something real together, something lasting and meaningful. Lyra looked out the window, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. The fields looked blurry, like she was seeing them through water. You don't know me. How can you be sure you want to build anything? I've been watching you. Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide. What? At the harvest festivals, at the interpack gatherings. You probably never noticed me, but I noticed you. His smile was slight, almost shy. You were always in the background, but that's what made you interesting. She fought back to those events, trying to remember. She'd always stayed out of the way, helping serve food or clean up after the celebrations, while the unmated females danced and flirted with visiting males. She'd made herself as invisible as possible, knowing that drawing attention would only invite pity or worse. You were always kind, Kieran said, his voice warming with memory. To the children who got underfoot and spilled things, to the elderly who needed help getting around, to the servants who were invisible to everyone else. You never put on airs or played games or tried to be something you weren't. You were just yourself. Boring, Lyra said flatly. Genuine. The word carried weight, like it meant something important to him. Do you know how rare that is? How many people I meet who are only showing me what they think I want to see. The carriage hit a bump in the road, jostling them both. Kieran reached out instinctively to steady her, his hand covering hers where it gripped the seat edge. The touch sent warmth racing up her arm, and she had to fight the urge to lean into it. I know this is overwhelming, he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'd like you to try. His hand was so warm, so careful. When was the last time someone had touched her gently? Her former mate had only touched her when he was trying to get her pregnant, and even then, it had felt more like duty than desire. Before that, she couldn't remember. Her parents weren't demonstrative people, and after her failure became apparent, even casual affection had dried up. What if I disappoint you? She asked, the words barely audible. What if you don't? I'm serious. She pulled her hand away, immediately missing the warmth. What if I can't be what you need? What if I'm not strong enough, or smart enough, or graceful enough? What if I embarrass you in front of your court, your pack, your enemies? Lyra. Her name on his lips stopped her spiraling thoughts like a physical touch. What if we just take this one day at a time and see what happens? One day at a time. It sounded so simple when he said it like that. Like the enormity of what lay ahead could be broken down into manageable pieces. The pack won't accept me, she said, voicing the fear that sat heaviest on her chest. Your people will expect you to choose someone worthy of being their Luna. Someone who can stand beside you and make them proud. Something dark flashed across Kieran's face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Let me worry about the pack. You can't just ignore them. They have expectations, needs. They have opinions. There's a difference. His voice carried an edge of steel that reminded her exactly who she was talking to. And opinions change. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but it made Lyra more nervous. She'd lived her whole life trying to meet other people's expectations and failing spectacularly. The thought of an entire pack judging her, finding her lacking, measuring her against some impossible standard made her stomach churn with familiar anxiety. Hey, Kieran's voice was gentler now, coaxing. Look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly, expecting to see impatience or frustration. Instead, she found something that might have been understanding. I didn't choose you to make anyone else happy, he said, leaning forward slightly. I chose you because when I saw you standing on that platform, looking like you'd accepted that you were worthless, all I wanted to do was show you how wrong you are. What if I am worthless, though? The words slipped out before she could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying. What if everyone else is right and you're the one who's wrong? Then I'm an idiot with terrible judgment who shouldn't be running a kingdom. He said it so matter-of-factly that she almost smiled. But I don't think so. Despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the certainty that this was all some elaborate mistake, Lyra felt her lips twitch. Maybe you are. Maybe. His answering smile was worn and real, transforming his whole face from stern authority to something approachable, almost boyish. But I don't think so. The carriage began to slow, and Kieran glanced out the window at the lengthening shadows. We'll stop here for the night. There's an inn up ahead that should have rooms available. Panic shot through her, cold and immediate. Together? Separate rooms, he said quickly, and she saw understanding flash in his eyes. Unless you'd prefer to keep traveling through the night. No, separate rooms is good. Fine. Perfect. She was babbling and couldn't seem to stop. I mean, I wouldn't want to presume, and obviously you'd want your privacy, and I'm sure I snore or something. Lyra! The gentle interruption stopped her rambling. Breathe. She did, drawing in a shaky breath that seemed to settle something loose and panicky in her chest. Relax, he said, and his smile was so worn she felt some of her tension ease. I'm not going to force anything on you. When something happens between us, it'll be because you want it to. When, not if. The confidence behind that single word made her cheeks warm and her pulse quicken. Not arrogance exactly, but a quiet certainty that made her wonder what he saw when he looked at her that she couldn't see herself. The inn was small but clean, with a common room that smelled like roasted meat and fresh bread. The moment they walked through the door, the innkeeper took one look at Kieran and started bowing and scraping, offering his finest rooms and his best food with the desperate eagerness of someone trying to make a good impression. Just 2 rooms and whatever you're serving for dinner, Kieran said calmly, seemingly unbothered by the attention. They ate in relative silence, the weight of the day settling over both of them like a heavy blanket. Lyra picked at her food, her mind racing too fast to focus on eating. This morning she'd woken up in her childhood bed, knowing her parents were going to sell her, but not knowing to whom. Tonight, she was sitting across from the most powerful man in the kingdom, who'd bought her and claimed he wanted to make her his mate. It felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare she hadn't woken up from yet. You should eat, Kieran said gently, nodding toward her barely touched plate. I'm not very hungry. Her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to accept food. "You're scared." It wasn't a question, so she didn't deny it. There was no point in pretending otherwise when her hands were shaking and she'd barely managed 3 bites. "Of me?" he asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question that made her look up. Lyra considered lying, then decided he deserved honesty. "A little, but mostly of this whole situation. This morning I thought the worst thing that could happen was being sold to someone awful. Now I don't know what to think." "The worst thing that could happen is that this doesn't work out and we go our separate ways." He said it like he was making a promise, calm and reasonable. "Is that really the worst thing?" she found herself asking. Kieran's expression grew serious, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "No, the worst thing would be if I hurt you, but I won't let that happen." "You can't control everything." The words slipped out, born from years of disappointment and broken promises. "I can control myself." There was something final in the way he said it, like he was making her a vow. And that's enough. Lyra wanted to believe him, but trust felt dangerous after so many betrayals. Every time she'd trusted someone, her parents, her former mate, the healers who'd promised they could fix her, she'd ended up disappointed, broken in new ways she hadn't known were possible. "I should go to bed," she said, pushing back from the table before she could say something she'd regret. Kieran stood as well, his movements fluid and controlled. "Lyra?" She paused at the base of the stairs, 1 foot on the first step. "Thank you for coming with me. I know you didn't have much choice, but thank you anyway." Her throat felt tight with unexpected emotion. "Thank you for buying me. I know that sounds strange, but the alternative would have been much worse. Much worse." The memory of the older man's yellowed teeth and wandering eyes made her shudder. "You don't have to thank me for basic decency," Kieran said quietly. But she did, because basic decency wasn't something she'd come to expect from the world. It was a gift, precious because it was so rare. In her small room upstairs, Lyra sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to process everything that had happened. The mattress was soft beneath her, softer than anything she'd slept on in years, and the sheets smelled like lavender and sunshine. This morning she'd been resigned to her fate, prepared for the worst. Now she was more confused than she'd ever been in her life. What did the Alpha King really want from her? And more terrifying, what if she started to want something from him in return? Outside her window, she could hear the soft sounds of the inn settling for the night. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the distant murmur of conversation from the common room below. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. While she sat in the dark, wondering if her life would ever be normal again, she thought about Kieran's hands, warm and gentle when he'd helped her from the platform. About his voice when he'd said her name, like it mattered. About the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or calculation, but with something that might have been genuine interest. What if he was telling the truth? What if this wasn't some elaborate game or political maneuvering? What if he actually wanted her? Barren and broken as she was, the thought was too dangerous to hold on to, too fragile to examine closely. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, it followed her into her dreams. Lyra barely slept. Every time she drifted off, she'd jolt awake, momentarily forgetting where she was until the unfamiliar room came into focus. The bed was too soft, the sounds too different. Her mind too full of questions that had no good answers. By the time pale gray light started filtering through the small window, she'd given up entirely on rest. She sat by the window in her shift, watching the sun rise over the road that led deeper into Kieran's territory. Each mile they traveled today would take her further from everything she'd ever known and closer to a life she couldn't begin to imagine. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Lyra, are you awake?" She scrambled to pull her dress on, fingers fumbling with the laces in her haste. "Just a moment." When she opened the door, she found Kieran already fully dressed and looking like he'd slept better than she had. His dark hair was damp, like he'd just washed, and he smelled clean and masculine in a way that made her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. We should leave soon if we want to reach the border by evening, he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with what might have been concern. Did you sleep at all? Some. It was a lie, and from his expression, not a convincing one. I'm ready to go. She wasn't, not really, would probably never be ready for what lay ahead. But what choice did she have? They ate breakfast quickly in the inn's common room, surrounded by the quiet chatter of other travelers starting their day. Lyra managed to force down some bread and honey, her stomach finally accepting food now that the initial shock was wearing off. Kieran kept the conversation light, pointing out landmarks visible through the windows and sharing stories about the territory they'd be crossing. As they prepared to leave, the innkeeper approached Kieran with obvious nervousness, wringing his hands and shooting glances at the other patrons who were pretending not to listen. "Your Majesty, forgive me," the man said, his voice pitched low but still audible across the quiet room. "But word has already spread about your companion." His eyes flicked to Lyra with barely concealed pity that made her cheeks burn. "People are talking," Kieran's expression hardened, the easy warmth disappearing from his face like clouds covering the sun. "Let them talk." "But sir, surely you understand the concerns." The innkeeper's voice grew more desperate. "A barren woman as Luna. The pack needs heirs, needs assurance of succession. People are saying, I understand that my choices are my own." Kieran's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And I don't recall asking for advice from an innkeeper." The man's face went white, and he bowed hastily. "Of course, Your Majesty, forgive me. I meant no disrespect." As the innkeeper retreated, Lyra felt heat flood her cheeks and spread down her neck. So it was starting already. The whispers, the judgment, the disbelief that someone like her could be chosen by someone like him. And this was just one small inn on a back road. What would it be like when they reached the capital, the court, the center of pack politics? "Ignore him," Kieran said quietly, as they walked toward their horses. But she could hear the tension in his voice. "How can I ignore it when he's right?" The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with all the fear and self-doubt she'd been trying to suppress. "People are going to talk, Kieran. They're going to wonder what's wrong with you for choosing someone defective." He stopped walking, so abruptly she nearly ran into him. When he turned to face her, his eyes blazed with something fierce and dangerous that made her breath catch. "Don't ever call yourself that again." The words were quiet, but they carried such intensity that she took a step back. "But I am. Everyone knows it. My own parents. Your parents were fools." His voice was low but vibrating with controlled anger. "Blind, short-sighted fools. And anyone who thinks less of you for something beyond your control is equally foolish." Lyra stared at him, caught off guard by the vehemence in his tone. She'd expected him to be reasonable, to acknowledge the practical concerns, to maybe even admit this was all a mistake. She hadn't expected this fierce defense of someone he barely knew. "You barely know me," she said, echoing her thoughts. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen how you carry yourself, despite everything that's been done to you." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in its intensity. "Because you thanked me for basic decency instead of demanding it as your right. Because you're still standing here, still functioning, still hoping for something better, when most people would have broken under the weight of what you've endured." His words hit her like physical blows, each one finding a mark she hadn't known was there. "But you think infertility makes you defective?" He moved even closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his stern gray eyes. "I've met plenty of fertile people who were worthless in every way that mattered. Cruel, selfish, small-minded people who could produce children but couldn't produce a moment of genuine kindness." Something cracked open in her chest at his words. Some wall she'd built around her heart starting to crumble. She'd been holding her breath for so long, waiting for him to see what everyone else saw, to realize his mistake and walk away. but the conviction in his voice made her wonder if maybe, impossibly, she was the one who was wrong. "I don't understand you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You will." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'll promise you that much." His touch was so gentle, it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. When was the last time someone had touched her with tenderness instead of duty or disgust? "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." Home. The word followed her as they mounted their horses and rode out of the inn yard, past the staring faces and whispered conversations. Kieran's home, not hers. She didn't have a home anymore, had been cast out from the only one she'd ever known. But the way he said it, like she belonged there, like she was wanted there, made something warm unfurl in her chest. They rode in comfortable silence for the first few hours, the road winding through forests and valleys that grew more beautiful with each mile. The trees were fuller here, the grass greener, the very air seeming cleaner and lighter. It was like entering a different world, one where the harsh realities of her old life felt distant and unreal. Lyra found herself stealing glances at Kieran as they rode, trying to reconcile the powerful Alpha King with the man who'd spoken so passionately in her defense. He sat his horse with easy confidence, relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Not paranoid exactly, but aware in a way that spoke of years of training and responsibility. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream that bubbled over smooth stones. "Anything." He dismounted and moved to help her down, his hands steady on her waist as her feet touched the ground. "Why me, really?" She held up a hand when he started to speak. Not the diplomatic answer about strength and resilience, the real reason. You could have any woman in the kingdom, beautiful, fertile, well-connected women who would bring you political alliances and social advantages. Why choose someone everyone will see as a liability? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he watched the water flow over the rocks. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, almost vulnerable. "Because I know what it feels like to be seen as a disappointment." Lyra frowned, certain she'd misheard. "That's impossible. You're the Alpha King. You're powerful, respected, feared." "I wasn't always." He sat down on the fallen log beside the stream, gesturing for her to join him. "I was the second son, never supposed to rule, never trained for it. My older brother Marcus was everything an heir should be, charismatic, strong, naturally gifted at politics and warfare. I was the spare who spent too much time reading and not enough time fighting." "What happened to him?" She settled beside him on the log, careful to leave space between them, even as she found herself wanting to move closer. "Killed in battle 3 years ago." His jaw tightened with old pain, leading a charge against raiders from the Northern Territories. He died like a hero, the way everyone expected him to live. And suddenly, I was thrust into a role I'd never been prepared for, leading people who'd expected someone else entirely. There was something raw in his voice that made her chest ache. That must have been terrifying. "Do you know what it's like to see doubt in every face when you walk into a room?" He looked at her, and she saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. "To know that people are waiting for you to fail, comparing you to someone who's not there anymore?" "Yes," Lyra said quietly, thinking of all the times she'd seen disappointment in her parents' faces, in her former mate's eyes, in the expressions of healers who couldn't fix what was wrong with her. "I do know that feeling." "Then you understand why I don't put much stock in what people expect." He met her gaze directly. "I chose you because when I saw you in that marketplace, I saw someone who'd survived things that would have destroyed weaker people. I saw someone who understood loss and disappointment, but hadn't let it make them cruel or bitter." "You saw all that in a few minutes?" The idea seemed impossible. "I saw enough." His smile was sad but genuine. Maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I'm hoping to find someone who won't look at me like I'm a poor substitute for the king they really wanted. The honesty in his admission took her breath away. She'd been so focused on her own inadequacies, her own fears of not measuring up, that she hadn't considered he might have his own insecurities, his own wounds that hadn't healed properly. For what it's worth, she said carefully, testing the words before she spoke them, you don't seem like a poor substitute for anything to me. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, then gratitude, then something warmer that made her pulse quicken and her cheeks heat. Thank you, he said simply, but she could hear how much the words meant to him. They resumed their journey, but the atmosphere between them had changed. The formal distance was still there, born of years of training and caution, but underneath it, Lyra sensed the beginning of something that felt dangerously like understanding. Like recognition of shared pain and the possibility of shared healing. As the day wore on, they encountered more travelers on the road. Word of Kieran's unconventional choice had apparently spread faster than their horses could carry them, traveling along trade routes and through pack networks with the speed of wildfire. Lyra saw the stairs, heard the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when they passed. The Alpha King's lost his mind, she caught one woman saying to her companion as they watered their horses at a public trough. Choosing a barren woman when the kingdom needs heirs? What's he thinking? Maybe he's under some kind of spell, the other replied, her voice carrying clearly on the still air. What else could explain it? Magic or madness, those are the only options. Lyra kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she felt each word like a physical blow. This was what she'd feared, not just for herself, but for Kieran. Her presence was already undermining his authority, making people question his judgment, his fitness to rule. Pull over, she said quietly when they were out of earshot, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. What? Kieran looked at her with concern. Stop the horses, please. Her hands were shaking on the reins. And she couldn't seem to draw a full breath. Kieran guided them off the main road to a small clearing shaded by oak trees. The moment they dismounted, Lyra's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in spring. This is a mistake, she said, pacing back and forth across the small space like a caged animal. Did you hear what they were saying? They think you've lost your mind. They think I've cast some kind of spell on you, that you're not capable of making rational decisions anymore. I don't care what they think. Kieran's voice was calm, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. You should care. She spun to face him, her voice rising. You're their king. You need their respect, their loyalty, their trust. How can you lead people who think you're making decisions based on magic or madness? Lyra, no, listen to me. She stopped pacing and faced him directly, desperation making her bold. I've accepted that my life was never going to be normal. I've made peace with being alone, with being seen as less than whole, with the fact that I'll never have the things other women take for granted. But I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. You think I'd give you up to appease people who don't know you? The question was quiet, but it hit her like a slap. She stared at him, trying to read his expression. Wouldn't you? Shouldn't you? Your kingdom, your people, your legacy. Will survive having a king who chooses his own mate instead of letting politics decide for him. He stepped closer, his intensity making her breath catch in her throat. Do you really think so little of yourself that you'd rather I abandon you than fight for what I want? The words struck deep, hitting truths she didn't want to acknowledge. I think I'm a realist. I know what I am, what I can't give you. And I know that kingdoms need heirs, need stability, not every king needs to father children to leave a legacy. His voice was firm, certain in a way that made her want to believe him. That's easy to say now, but what about in 5 years, 10? She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces that felt like they were falling apart. When the pressure from your council becomes too much to ignore, when your pack demands you put duty above personal feeling, Kieran was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, seen in ways that were both terrifying and thrilling. When he spoke, his voice was gentler, but no less certain. 3 years ago, when Marcus died, I thought my life was over. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. I thought I'd spend every day trying to fill shoes that were too big for me, failing at a job I'd never wanted, and disappointing people who deserved better. His hands were warm around hers, calloused from sword work, but surprisingly gentle. She found herself focusing on that touch, using it to anchor herself against the storm of fear and doubt threatening to sweep her away. But maybe that's not what this is about, he continued. Maybe it's not about trying to be Marcus or trying to be the king everyone expected. Maybe it's about building something different, something that's ours. What if different isn't enough? The question slipped out, raw and honest. What if it's better? He said it with such simple conviction that she felt some of her panic ease. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curved around hers like they belonged there. I'm scared, she admitted, the words barely audible. So am I. The confession surprised her into looking up. I'm terrified that you'll decide I'm not worth the fight, that you'll realize you could have a quieter life with someone else, someone who doesn't come with a crown and all the complications that go with it. Someone else? The idea was so foreign it almost made her laugh. Kieran, who else would want me? I'm damaged goods, remember? That's why my parents sold me in the first place. Anyone with sense would want you. He said it with such simple certainty that tears pricked her eyes. But I'm selfish enough to hope you'll choose me anyway. The tears spilled over then, hot and fast, but not from sadness, from something she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or the unfamiliar feeling of being valued for who she was instead of pitied for what she lacked. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to be someone's mate, someone's partner. I don't know how to be worthy of the faith you're putting in me. Neither do I. His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, the touch so gentle it made her heart ache. But I'd like to try, if you're willing. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw not the untouchable alpha king, but a man who'd been thrust into a role he hadn't chosen, who carried his own doubts and fears, a man who'd looked at her and seen something worth fighting for when she couldn't see it herself. Okay, she said, the word barely audible, but carrying all the hope and terror and desperate longing she'd been trying to suppress. Okay? His smile was tentative, like he was afraid to believe her. I'm willing to try. The words felt like jumping off a cliff, but also like finally learning to fly. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night, warm and bright and full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Thank you, he said, bringing her hands to his lips and pressing soft kisses to her knuckles. The gesture sent warmth shooting through her, spreading from the point of contact to fill her chest with something that might have been hope. For the first time since her parents had announced their decision to sell her, Lyra felt like maybe, impossibly, things might actually work out. The ride back to the estate felt different. Lighter somehow, despite the weight of what they'd just committed to. Kieran's hand brushed hers as they rode side by side, and when she didn't pull away, his fingers intertwined with hers. The simple contact sent little sparks of warmth up her arm. And she found herself stealing glances at his profile, memorizing the strong line of his jaw and the way his hair caught the afternoon light. There's something I should warn you about, he said as the main building came into view through the trees. Tomorrow the council meets. They've been vocal about their concerns regarding our bond. The lightness in her chest dimmed like clouds covering the sun. What kind of concerns? The usual. Questions about heirs, about political alliances I'm not making by choosing you instead of some alpha's daughter. His jaw tightened with barely suppressed irritation. They seem to think they have a say in who I mate with. Lyra's steps slowed, dread pooling in her stomach. Maybe they're right to be concerned. I can't give you what other women could. The connections, the children, the... Stop. He turned to face her, hands firm on her shoulders. Don't let them get in your head before they've even spoken. You're my choice, Lyra. Mine. Not theirs. But even his conviction couldn't quiet the familiar voice in her head, the one that whispered she wasn't enough, would never be enough. Should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection came her way. What if they refuse to accept me? What if they demand you choose someone else? Then they'll learn what happens when someone disrespects my mate. The steel in his voice should have been comforting, but instead, it made her stomach twist with anxiety. I don't want to cause problems between you and your people. The words came out in a rush. I don't want to be the reason your rule is questioned. Your authority undermined. You're not causing anything, he said firmly. They are, by refusing to see what I see in you. He cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. Trust me to handle them. Can you do that? She wanted to say yes. The words sat on her tongue, ready to be spoken, but doubt held it back like a physical weight. I'll try, she managed instead. It wasn't the answer he wanted. She could see it in his eyes, but he nodded anyway. That's enough for now. But even as he said it, Lyra could see the worry in his expression, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring challenges neither of them was fully prepared for. The next morning came too soon, announced by pale gray light filtering through her bedroom windows. Lyra had spent the night in a guest room that was larger and more luxurious than any space she'd ever called her own, but sleep had eluded her completely. She'd paced the thick carpets, stared out at the gardens, and changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple green dress that Kieran had said brought out her eyes. Not that it mattered. No amount of pretty fabric could change what she was, could give her the qualifications everyone expected in an alpha king's mate. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Kieran. Instead, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair entered carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, miss. I'm Elena, the head housekeeper. Alpha Kieran thought you might not feel like eating in the dining hall this morning." "That obvious I'm terrified?" Lyra tried to inject some humor into her voice, but fell short. Elena set the tray down on the small table by the window and gave her a knowing look. "Only to someone who's been there herself. When I first mated with the beta 20 years ago, the other pack wives made my life hell for months. Said I wasn't good enough, didn't come from the right bloodline, would drag him down." "How did you get through it?" Lyra asked, desperate for any advice. "Realized their opinions didn't matter as much as I thought they did. The only person who needed to approve of me was my mate and myself." She squeezed Lyra's shoulder with gentle fingers. "Eat something, dear. You'll need your strength today." Lyra managed a few bites of toast and honey before her stomach rebelled, nodding with anxiety. The council meeting wasn't until afternoon, but already she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. She spent the morning in the estate's gardens, trying to lose herself in the simple, mindless task of weeding flower beds. The work felt familiar, grounding, reminding her of happier times when she'd helped her mother tend their small kitchen garden. But even the repetitive motions couldn't quiet her racing thoughts. What would she say if they asked her directly about her infertility? How could she defend a choice she still didn't fully understand herself? How could she stand beside Kieran when everyone in that room would be thinking about all the ways she was inadequate? They're arriving. Kieran's voice behind her made her jump, sending dirt scattering from her hands. She turned to find him watching her with worried eyes, his formal clothes a reminder that this wasn't just any day. Already? She glanced at the sun's position, surprised by how much time had passed. Council members like to come early, stake out their positions before the official meeting starts. He held out his hand, his fingers already clean while hers were stained with soil and grass. "Walk with me?" She brushed her hands on her skirt, knowing it was futile but needing the few seconds to compose herself. When she took his offered hand, his fingers closed around hers with gentle pressure. "Do I have to be there?" she asked, as they started walking along the garden paths. "For the meeting, I mean. Maybe it would be better if, not officially," he interrupted gently. "But they'll want to see you, to evaluate you for themselves. And honestly, I'd rather have you where I can keep an eye on things." They walked the perimeter of the estate grounds, Kieran pointing out landmarks and sharing stories that she suspected he was making up just to distract her from the approaching confrontation. It helped, a little, the sound of his voice and the warmth of his hand in hers, providing anchor points against her anxiety. Until they rounded the corner near the main entrance and came face to face with three men in expensive suits, their expressions ranging from curious to openly dismissive. Kieran, the tallest one, stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. His gaze slid over Lyra with barely concealed assessment, cataloging her simple dress, her work-stained hands, her obvious nervousness. "We were hoping to speak with you before the formal session. Councilman Barrett." Kieran's voice could have frozen fire, all traces of warmth disappearing. "I don't believe you've met my mate, Lyra." Barrett's smile was all politeness and no warmth, the kind of expression politicians wore when they needed to appear gracious while thinking the opposite. "Indeed, we've been quite curious to meet the woman who's captured our Alpha King's attention so thoroughly." The way he said it made Lyra's skin crawl, like there was something distasteful about the very idea. She managed a small nod, not trusting her voice. "Councilman." Such a surprising choice. One of the other men said, his tone suggesting surprise wasn't quite the right word, given the circumstances. Kieran's arm tightened around Lyra's waist, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "What circumstances would those be, Davis?" Davis exchanged a glance with his companions before answering. "Come now, we all know why she was available for purchase at market. It's hardly a state secret." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks, spreading down her neck and across her chest. She wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but standing here while strangers discussed her failures like items on a business ledger. The urge to defend herself warred with the crushing weight of knowing they weren't wrong. "Watch your tongue." Kieran's voice was deadly quiet, carrying a threat that made all three men shift uncomfortably. "You're speaking about my mate." "We're speaking about the future of this pack," Barrett said smoothly, his politician's training allowing him to recover quickly. "Surely you understand our concerns about the succession, about what message this sends to—" "The succession is not your concern. With respect, Alpha King, everything that affects this pack's stability is our concern." Barrett's voice grew more pointed. "And an infertile Luna raises questions that—" "Finish that sentence." Kieran stepped forward, and something in his posture made all three men step back instinctively. Every line of his body radiated controlled danger, the kind of threat that came from absolute certainty of one's own power. "Please, I'm very interested to hear how you plan to end it." The silence stretched like a taut wire, filled with tension that made Lyra's breath come short. She could see the calculation in the councilman's eyes, the weighing of political necessity against personal safety. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. "It's all right," she said quietly, her voice barely audible but cutting through the tension. "They're not wrong. Lyra!" Kieran's voice held a warning, but she was already speaking. "No, it's fine." She looked at the three councilmen directly, forcing herself to meet their eyes despite the shame burning in her throat like acid. "Yes, I'm infertile. Yes, that's why my parents sold me at market. Yes, I can't give Kieran heirs or political alliances or any of the things you think he needs. If that's what you need to hear to get this conversation over with, there it is. Barrett had the grace to look uncomfortable, his smooth politician's mask slipping slightly. We appreciate your honesty. I wasn't finished. The words surprised her as much as them, coming from some deep well of anger she hadn't known existed. You want to talk about what I can't give him? Fine. But you don't get to stand there and pretend this is about pack stability when what you really mean is that I'm not good enough for him. Now see here, Davis started, his face flushing. No, you see here. The anger felt good, cleaner than shame, stronger than fear. I know what I am. I know what I can't do. But I also know that Kieran chose me anyway, with full knowledge of my limitations. And if you have a problem with his judgment, maybe you should ask yourself why you think you know better than your Alpha King. Davis opened his mouth to respond, but Kieran cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. You heard her. Any other concerns, or are we done here? The three men exchanged glances that spoke of hasty recalculation and political retreat. We'll see you at the meeting, Barrett said stiffly, his tone making it clear this conversation was far from over. As they walked away, Lyra felt her knees go weak with reaction. The anger that had sustained her through the confrontation was already fading, leaving behind shaky exhaustion and the growing realization of what she'd just done. Oh, God, she breathed. I can't believe I just said that to them. They're going to hate me even more now. I can believe it. Kieran's voice was full of something that might have been pride, warm and admiring in a way that made her chest flutter. You were magnificent. I was terrified. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Even better, he turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Bravery without fear isn't brave, it's just reckless. What you just did, standing up to them despite being afraid, that's real courage. She took inventory of her emotions, surprised by what she found underneath the fear and exhaustion. I feel angry. Still scared, but angry too. Good. His smile was fierce, approving. Hold on to that. You're going to need it. The formal council meeting was held in a wood-paneled room that smelled of old books, leather, and generations of difficult conversations. Portraits of former Alpha Kings lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with judgment. Lyra sat in a chair positioned slightly behind Kieran's at the head of the long table. Close enough to hear every word, but far enough back to feel like an observer rather than a participant. There were 12 council members total, and from their expressions as they filed in, Barrett wasn't the only one with concerns about Kieran's choice. The meeting started with routine pack business, territory disputes that needed arbitration, trade agreements that required approval. Budget allocations for various infrastructure projects, but Lyra could feel the tension building toward the real reason they were all there. She tried to focus on the mundane details, to lose herself in discussions of grain prices and border patrols, but her attention kept drifting to the faces around the table. Some were openly skeptical, others merely curious. But all of them were evaluating her with the calculating gaze of people who saw her as a problem to be solved. Finally, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes cleared her throat. If we could address the elephant in the room, Alpha King. The pack is concerned about your recent mating choice. Are they? Kieran's voice was mild, but Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders. Or are you? The distinction hardly matters if it affects pack morale and stability. The woman, Councilwoman Hayes, Lyra remembered, leaned forward slightly. Surely you can understand our position. Kieran leaned back in his chair, the picture of casual confidence despite the hostile atmosphere. What specifically is affecting morale, Councilwoman Hayes? You know very well what. Hayes's tone was crisp, professional, but with an undertone of frustration. The rumors about your mate's condition have spread throughout the pack. People are asking questions about the succession, about what happens if you die without an heir, about the message this sends to our allies and enemies. The same thing that happens to any pack when their alpha dies without an heir. Kieran replied calmly. The council chooses a new leader according to established protocols. That's not how it works with the Alpha King title, and you know it, Barrett interjected, apparently recovered from their earlier confrontation. The crown has passed through bloodlines for centuries, breaking that tradition without clear succession planning. Tradition? Kieran's voice sharpened like a blade being drawn. Like the tradition that says a king should mate for political advantage rather than personal choice? Or the tradition that says a woman's worth is measured solely by her fertility? Murmurs rose around the table, some approving, others clearly disapproving. Hayes held up a hand for silence, her expression stern. No one is questioning your mate's personal worth. Aren't you? Kieran stood slowly, his presence suddenly filling the room like a storm front. Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what you're doing. You're telling me that the woman I've chosen to spend my life with isn't acceptable because she can't produce an heir. You're reducing her to nothing more than a breeding vessel. That's not what we're saying, Davis protested. Then what are you saying? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra watched the council members shift uncomfortably in their seats, their carefully prepared arguments seeming to crumble under Kieran's direct assault. She could see them recalculating, trying to find a way to voice their concerns without seeming to attack her directly. Finally, a younger man near the end of the table spoke up, his voice carrying the earnestness of someone who genuinely believed in his cause. We're saying that perhaps you should consider the greater good, Alpha King. Your personal happiness is important. But your duty to the pack, to the kingdom. My duty to the pack is to be the best leader I can be, Kieran interrupted. Having a mate who supports me, who makes me stronger, who challenges me to be better, that serves the pack's interests far more than some political marriage ever could. But the bloodline, another councilman began. The bloodline ends with me regardless. Kieran's voice was flat, final, carrying the weight of absolute decision. I've made my choice. Lyra is my mate, now and always. If that's unacceptable to this council, you're welcome to call for a vote of no confidence. The threat hit the room like a physical blow. Calling for such a vote was technically possible under pack law, but it would mean civil war, chaos, the potential destruction of everything they'd all worked to build. Everyone in the room knew it, and the knowledge settled over them like a shroud. Hayes was the first to recover her composure, her political instincts kicking in. No one wants that, Alpha King. We're simply trying to understand your reasoning, to find a way to present this to the pack that maintains stability and confidence. There's nothing to understand. Kieran's eyes swept the room, meeting each gaze directly. I've found my mate. The pack will accept her because I've chosen her, and because she's worthy of acceptance regardless of what she can or can't give me. His voice grew harder. Anyone who can't manage that basic respect can find themselves a new pack. The silence that followed was deafening. Lyra felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from something fiercer. Gratitude, amazement, a fierce joy she'd never expected to feel. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever made her feel like she was worth defending, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Are there any other concerns? Kieran asked mildly, as if he hadn't just threatened to tear apart his own government. The council members looked anywhere but at him, the fight gone out of them, in the face of his absolute certainty. Finally, Hayes cleared her throat. I think we've covered everything that needs to be discussed today. Excellent. Kieran's smile was sharp as a blade. Then this meeting is adjourned. As the room slowly emptied, council members filing out with murmured conversations and carefully neutral expressions, Lyra remained seated, overwhelmed by what she'd just witnessed. Kieran had just put everything on the line for her. His relationship with his advisors, his political stability, potentially even his throne. "You didn't have to do that," she said when they were alone, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I did." He pulled a chair over to sit directly in front of her, their knees almost touching. "Lyra, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing something there that made her breath catch, not just determination or duty, but something deeper, more personal. "I meant every word I said in there," he continued, his voice intense but gentle. "You are worthy of respect, worthy of defense, worthy of love, not because of what you can give me, but because of who you are. I'm nobody special," she started, the old refrain automatic after years of repetition. "You're everything special." His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "You're brave and honest and strong. You've survived things that would have broken other people, and you've done it with grace and dignity. You see the good in people even when they don't deserve it. You make me want to be better than I am." The tears came then, hot and fast, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and hope and terror. "Then let me believe it for both of us," he said softly, "until you can believe it for yourself." She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his, breathing in his scent, drawing strength from his certainty. "What if I never can? What if I'm always going to be the woman who thinks she's not good enough? Then I'll spend every day for the rest of our lives proving you wrong." The simple certainty in his voice broke something open in her chest. Not broke, but opened, like a door she'd kept locked for so long she'd forgotten what was behind it. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them, before she could second-guess or take them back. His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." When he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, it felt like a vow, a beginning, a declaration that they were in this together. Whatever came next, for the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she might actually be enough. But their peace was short-lived. The morning brought news that changed everything, carried by Marcus, Kieran's beta, whose grin expression made Lyra's stomach drop before he even spoke. She was in the garden again, finding solace in the simple tasks of tending growing things, when Marcus found her. His usual easy smile was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the tight lines of someone bearing bad news. "There's been an incident at the eastern border," he said without preamble. "Raiders from the Black Moon Pack. They've taken 3 of our people." Her blood ran cold. The Black Moon Pack was notorious throughout the region for their brutality, especially toward anyone they perceived as weak or vulnerable. Women, children, anyone who couldn't fight back became targets for their particular brand of cruelty. "What does Kieran want to do?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He's already gone." Marcus's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "Left at dawn with a strike force. But there's something else, Lyra. Something you need to know." The way he said her name, careful and gentle, like he was handling something breakable, made her stomach drop even further. "What?" The raiders didn't just take random people. They specifically asked for the Alpha King's barren mate. His voice was gentle, but the words hit like physical blows. "This was planned, coordinated. Someone told them about you, about your situation. They want you." The world tilted sideways, her vision graying at the edges. She gripped the garden gate to keep from falling, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. "They want me," she repeated numbly. "Kieran will never let that happen," Marcus said fiercely, stepping closer as if to catch her if she fell. "But Lyra, the pack elders are already talking. They're saying that I should go." The words came out flat, emotionless, but inside she was screaming that 3 innocent lives are worth more than 1 broken woman. Marcus stepped even closer, his voice vibrating with intensity. You are not broken, and Kieran would burn the world before he'd let them take you. But even as he said it, Lyra was already moving toward the house, her mind working with crystalline clarity despite the emotional chaos. She knew what she had to do. 3 innocent people were suffering because of her, because someone wanted to hurt Kieran through her. Their pain was her fault, her responsibility. She made it to the bedroom she shared with Kieran before the full weight of it hit her. All the progress she'd made, all the healing, all of Kieran's patient love and fierce protection, and she was still the same burden she'd always been. Still the woman whose very existence caused pain to others. The small bag she'd arrived with was still in the wardrobe. She pulled it out and began filling it mechanically, not taking much because she wouldn't need much where she was going. The Black Moon Pack wasn't known for allowing their captives to live long, comfortable lives. An hour later, the door opened. She looked up from where she sat on the bed, expecting Marcus or maybe Elena with updates about the hostage situation. Instead, Kieran filled the doorway. His clothes were torn and stained with dirt and blood. There was a cut on his left cheek, but his eyes were blazing with something that took her breath away. Relief, triumph, and underneath it all, a fear so raw it made her chest ache. You're back. She stood on shaking legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hostages, are they safe? All 3 of them. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with careful precision. We hit their camp before dawn. They never saw us coming. Relief flooded through her so fast it made her dizzy, her knees nearly buckling. Thank the gods. I was so worried. I thought, were you planning to leave? The quiet question stopped her cold. She looked at him, really looked, and saw something that made her heart clench with sudden understanding. Fear. Raw, undisguised fear that had nothing to do with battles or raiders, and everything to do with the bag sitting by the window. The bag by the window, he continued, his voice deadly calm. The way you're standing, like you're ready to bolt. The look on your face. He moved closer, each step deliberate and controlled. You were going to sacrifice yourself, weren't you? Trade yourself for them. She lifted her chin, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. 3 lives, Kieran. 3 people with families and futures and things to live for. Of course I was going to. And what about you? The words came out like a roar, making her flinch. What about your life? Your future? What about us? I'm not worth 3 people, she said, the old mantras rising automatically to her lips. I'm not even worth 1. I can't give you children. I can't give you political advantages. I can't even exist without putting innocent people at risk. Maybe everyone was right from the beginning. Maybe you should have chosen someone else. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Kieran crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her against him, so hard she gasped, her feet nearly leaving the floor. Don't you ever say that again, he said roughly, his voice muffled against her hair. Don't you ever suggest that I should want anyone else. But the pack needs, she started, but he cut her off. The pack needs their alpha to be strong, and I am never stronger than when I'm with you. He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with desperate intensity. Do you want to know why those raiders targeted you specifically? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Because they knew that hurting you would destroy me. Not because you're weak, Lyra, but because you're my greatest strength. They understood what you still refuse to see, that you are the most important thing in my world. Fresh tears started, hot and fast. I was so scared they would hurt those people because of me. Because I exist. Because you chose me. And I was terrified that you would try to save them by throwing your life away. His thumbs brushed away her tears with gentle strokes. When Marcus told me you were packing, when I realized you were ready to walk into their hands to spare 3 people you'd never even met, what would you have done? The question slipped out before she could stop it, raw and desperate. If I had gone to them, if they had taken me. His smile was sharp as a blade, all teeth and lethal promise. I would have painted the earth red, getting you back. There is no force in this world, no army, no treaty, no political consideration that could stop me from coming for you. The fierce certainty in his voice sent heat racing through her, primal and powerful. Even if it meant war, even if it meant destroying everything you've built, especially then. His forehead touched hers, his breath warm against her skin. Haven't you figured it out yet? You're not my weakness, Lyra. You're my power. You're the reason I fight, the reason I lead, the reason I get up every morning ready to face whatever the world throws at us. I love you. The words came easier now, natural as breathing, as inevitable as sunrise. Even when I doubt everything else, I never doubt that. Then trust it. Trust us. Trust that what we have is worth fighting for. His lips brushed hers, soft and sweet and full of promise. I don't need children to make me complete, Lyra. I need you. Only you. Something settled deep in her chest, the peace she'd never felt before. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. The elders won't be happy about this, about you choosing me over pack politics, over practical considerations. Then they can learn to live with disappointment. He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to that rumble that made her knees weak. I already told Hayes that if anyone else questions my choice of mate, they're welcome to challenge me directly. Lyra couldn't help but smile at that, imagining the faces of the council members when confronted with that particular ultimatum. I'm sure that went over well. About as well as you'd expect. Thompson actually turned pale. His grin was wicked, boyish despite everything they've been through. But do you know what Hayes said after the others left? What? That it's about time someone around here fought for love instead of duty. He spun her around, making her laugh despite the emotional exhaustion, despite the fear that still lurked at the edges of her consciousness. Even my most practical council member thinks I made the right choice. When he set her down, she was breathless and dizzy and happier than she'd ever been. The bag by the window seemed like an artifact from another life. A reminder of the woman she'd been instead of the woman she was becoming. So what happens now? She asked, settling into the circle of his arms like she belonged there. Now we live our lives. We rule this pack together. We show everyone that strength comes in many forms, and that love is the most powerful force of all. He caught her hands in his thumbs tracing over her knuckles. And if anyone doesn't like it, they're welcome to leave. You'd really dissolve your own pack for me? The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. I'd dissolve my own kingdom for you. The simple truth in his voice stole her breath. But I won't have to, because they're starting to see what I saw from the beginning, that you're exactly what we need. She wanted to argue, to list all the ways she was still inadequate, still failing to meet the basic requirements of her role. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about what she could do for him or the pack. This was about who she was, flaws and failures and all. I'm still going to have bad days, she warned, wanting him to understand what he was signing up for. Days when I forget my worth, when the old voices get too loud to ignore. Then I'll remind you. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing kisses to her palms, to her wrists, to the pulse points that betrayed how fast her heart was beating. Every day if I have to. And I'm still never going to give you biological children. That's not going to change, no matter how much we love each other. And I'm still never going to care. His smile was radiant, lighting up his whole face. There are plenty of ways to build a family, Lyra. Plenty of ways to leave a legacy. But there's only one way to find your true mate. And I already have. The last of her resistance crumbled. Not broke. Transformed. All her walls, all her defenses, all her careful protection of her heart simply became unnecessary. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely safe. "Marry me," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. Not just the political ceremony they'll expect, a real wedding with vows that mean something. His eyes went wide with surprise and delight. "Are you proposing to me?" Maybe. She felt bold, reckless, drunk on his love and her own newfound courage. "Is that a problem?" "The only problem is that you beat me to it." He dropped to one knee right there in their bedroom, still dirty from battle, still smelling like sweat and victory and home. "Lyra, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because the pack needs a Luna, but because I need you. Because I love you beyond reason, and I want to spend every day of my life proving it." Yes. The word came out as a sob. Joy and relief and overwhelming love all tangled together. Yes, always yes. When he stood and kissed her, she tasted salt and realized they were both crying. Happy tears this time, healing tears that washed away the last of her old life and made space for something new and beautiful and entirely their own. "I have something for you," he said against her lips, his voice rough with emotion. "I was going to wait for the right moment, but this is the right moment." She pulled back to look at him, seeing their future reflected in his storm-gray eyes. "This is perfect." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Not the elaborate royal signet she'd expected, heavy with jewels and political significance, but something simple and beautiful. A single stone that caught the light like captured starfire, set in a band that looked worn smooth by loving hands. "It was my grandmother's," he said as he slipped it onto her finger with reverent care. "She told my grandfather that she didn't need the biggest gem in the kingdom, just the one that was meant for her." He lifted her hand to admire how the ring looked against her skin. Like us, Lyra stared at the ring, at this man who had seen her worth when she couldn't, at the life they were building together from the ashes of their separate pain. The stone seemed to pulse with inner light, and she found herself thinking of all the women who had worn it before her. All the love stories that had led to this moment. "I used to think my infertility was a curse," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That it made me less than other women, marked me as defective and unwanted." And now? Kieran's voice was equally soft, careful, like he was afraid of breaking the spell. "Now I think maybe it was just clearing the path for this for us." She looked up at him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "Maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe I was just waiting." "For what?" "For someone who would love me exactly as I am." She rose up on her toes to kiss him again, tasting possibility and promise and forever. "For someone who would choose me not despite my flaws, but including them." His arms tightened around her, solid and warm and absolutely certain. "Always, Lyra. In every life, in every world, in every possible future, I would choose you." Outside their window, she could hear the sounds of the pack going about their daily lives. People who had learned to accept her, to see her value, to understand that strength came in forms they hadn't expected. A community that was becoming home in ways she'd never dared to dream. But here in Kieran's arms, with his ring on her finger and his love surrounding her like armor against the world's cruelty, Lyra finally understood the truth that had taken her so long to see. She wasn't the broken woman who had been sold at market like damaged goods. She wasn't the burden her parents had discarded when she failed to meet their expectations. She wasn't even the frightened girl who had stepped into this territory, expecting nothing but duty and disappointment. She was Lyra, future Luna, beloved mate, chosen woman, warrior in her own right, fighting battles against self-doubt and societal expectations with nothing but love as her weapon. She was enough. She had always been enough. And finally, she was ready to believe it. The late afternoon sun slanted through their bedroom windows, painting everything in gold and amber. And Lyra thought that maybe this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges still to come, but real and hard-won, and absolutely, completely theirs. Outside, she could hear Elena calling the pack to evening meal, could smell bread baking, and hear children laughing in the courtyard. Normal sounds of normal life, the kind of peaceful domesticity she'd thought was forever beyond her reach. "Come on," Kieran said, taking her hand and twining their fingers together. "Let's go show them their future, Luna. Let's go home." Home. The words settled into her heart like it had always belonged there, warm and right and full of promise. And as they walked toward their new life together, Lyra knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had everything else, together with love as their foundation and hope as their guide. She was enough, they were enough, and that was more than enough to build a lifetime on.